All right, so if you've been following this little video series, you know that we're converting this boat, which is currently a mess, into a tiller boat. Step one for that, for any Mercury boat, is going to be purchase some sort of tiller upgrade. I decided to go with the Mercury big tiller, and it finally arrived. So let's do a quick unboxing. So it comes crated up, heavily packed in the foam. I definitely already got into it. I admit it. Look at this thing. It's gorgeous. It doesn't weigh anything. That's it, baby. That's what all this is about. The Mercury big tiller. It's a fine piece of hardware. Now I'm assuming in here we got box parts, small parts, and I'm hoping there's a manual. Crisis averted. The manual is in the small parts box. We got some things. Some parts bag assembly. It contains some more different things. Got a manual. I guess I should at least look at it. Big tiller operation manual. And time. So before we get into the install of this thing, I think we should just take a moment to marvel at this guy because it looks freaking great. Here is, you got keys. You got where the keys plug into. Here's where your kill cord goes. Here's your shifter. Big, soft, rubber, meaty shifter, nice and smooth. Here's where the RPM adjuster would go if you bought one. I did not. I don't know if I need it just yet, so I'm not going to waste the money on it. Here's your shifter. Your throttle. And then there's your tilt and trim, all right there. And then you have the little knob that you retract to be able to pop the motor up, pop the tiller arm up to get it up out of the way, or for trailering, or to fold it down. This whole thing replaced 90% of the crap that this thing does. Excellent space savings. Much lighter weight. So from a cursory glance, it looks like the instructions are fairly complete, but I should mention that all the hardware that you need, as far as I can tell, is included with the tiller arm. The only additional thing that you'll need to buy is the RPM adjuster and or the light, which I don't know if the light's available for the smaller tiller arm, and also the cable kit. The cable kit you buy and the tiller arm you buy will be dependent on whether or not your motor previously had a tiller, so you're upgrading their small tiller to the big tiller, or whether or not you're converting a console boat. As you know, we are converting a console boat, so I had to buy the one for a console style boat, a non-previously tillered motor. So your mileage may vary, your install is probably going to be different, but I'm still going to walk you through the installation as I'm doing it, and we'll hope that I don't make a complete disaster out of it. We'll see how it goes. Also, another quick note that I'm going to throw out there. For this installation, it looks like a lot of the components are like threaded components, so I'm going to use hand tools every step of the way where I can. If they suggest torque specs, I'm going to use them. Generally, when it comes to dealing with nuts and bolts, especially when the components themselves are lightweight aluminum or cast and threaded, I definitely go by like the minimum necessary force principle, where I start with hand tools, the normal hand tool, then maybe a breaker bar, and I scale up and try not to just like strip everything out. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. I would suggest you do the same thing. Again, it looks like we're dealing with a lot of threaded components that are permanent parts like the housings of the motor. So, but I think as long as you stick with hand tools, you should be fine. So step one is just using a 5/8 socket. You have to use, using a flathead screwdriver, you press these little tabs out of the way and you unbolt this guy on both sides and get this guy out of the way. Like so. So those are out of the way, and this just pulls right out of the way. Kind of no big deal. Next component we're working on is this little, I'm assuming is a little plastic plug in here. Comes right out. Comes right out. It should come right out. It's not coming right out. Little plastic plug in here. So there it is exposed. All it was just a little rubber stopper, which is a good job on frickin' Mercury's part to plug that up so the threads don't get all covered in schmoo. Good noodling. And so we're gonna take this here little thread. Yes, I'm reading the directions, I know. Take this here little threaded rod and we're gonna thread it in there until 7/8 of an inch of it is sticking up. Once that's all threaded in, the next thing is to add that first little disc brake component. And then we're gonna thread in, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a little threaded insert there and over here that we're gonna thread this guy into that I believe is gonna serve as basically the rotor to the, whatever disc of the braking system that allows to control the tension on the arm so it doesn't swing super freely or with too much friction. So I got it bolted down on both sides. And the way it's engineered, it looks like there's supposed to be a little bit of play in there because it's kind of an unusual bolt with a little bit of a spacer. So I'm just gonna keep operating on the principle that it's supposed to be like that. Well, so based on all this nonsense, the next component to go, this makes sense, right? Because there's your first brake. Okay, here's your second. See if you can get you a better look at that. Okay, so see how it clamps on that? And then we got a nylon washer. Okay, and then we got this thing, the little adjuster arm. Allegedly, I guess. Okay, and then we get the nylock washer. This guy goes on next. And voila, the co-pilot is installed. I'm assuming there's probably a step to calibrate this later, but this adjuster controls how freely the whole motor rotates. So there it's a lot tighter, there it's a lot looser. So you can get that dialed in with the tiller arm on depending on how much freedom of movement you need. So on this god darn thing, it's saying that there's a secondary friction boot type deal. According to this, should be here, but I don't have one of those, and this is cast right in, so I don't, yeah, it's supposed to be right there, right? That little black and white picture makes it look like it should be right there, and I got nothing that looks like it. So we're gonna move on and hope it's not that pressing. So next step, we gotta trim the motor up, put this little tiny grease fitting. Focus. Focus. Come on. Focus. Come on. Here we go. I'm gonna get this little grease fitting all up in there. There's a little spot for a threaded insert, which will allow me to grease that assembly later. So we're gonna thread that guy in there. Hopefully those threads are clear and this thing will just slide right in. And there she is, all threaded in, ready to receive grease. In a noble effort to dummy-proof this thing a little bit, we got the decal stuck on there as per the important step in the directions. So the next step is actually to take out all these little screws on the bottom panel to install the shift and throttle cables. And voila. 8 machine screws later, she's opened up. So after a little bit of trial and error, we bolted on the throttle and the steering cable. You can tell which is which by the length to their little brackets. It's not super intuitive, but you want to kick the wiring harness out of the way and then put it through the boot last. So the whole assembly looks like this. And there is actually a right and wrong way to mount the boot based on the way the little grommet's shaped. It should be obvious, but you want the fatter part sticking out. So you got your 2 shift cables greased up. You got your cable. And I just actually had to take the cover back off because I forgot one simple little step. There's a little bracket here where you zip tie the 14-pin wiring harness to that little bracket. The next step is to mount this baby up. Got all the hardware. Got a couple of washers and some of these locking tabs. Torque spec's like 40 foot-pounds. 40 foot-pounds. We're gonna bolt this guy on, and then we're gonna call it a night. Will you take a look at that piece of hardware? Oh man. am very pleased with this. So the easiest way to install it is to clip the arm up thusly. Make sure you spend a little bit of time cleaning those threads out. Put a little bit of anti-seize on the bolts. Make sure they thread good. It's kind of unusual that the factory bolts were a 5/8 and these are a 17 millimeter, but the threading is the same. The little fold-over tabs, well, I have not folded over the little fold-over retention tabs because I have not torqued those to spec. In the off chance that I need to actually take this arm off again for some step that I have forgotten or missed, we'll get there. But I am very pleased with this little setup. So that will conclude day 1 of the install. The tiller arm is mounted, but all of the original steering cable is still in the way. The original shift and throttle cables are still attached in the original wiring. Tomorrow we'll take the cowl cover off and mount all of that up. But I think this is a pretty successful day 1 of this project, and I am thrilled to death with that tiller arm. Oh man, I can't wait to take this out on the water. All right, team, we're ready to start day 2 of the tiller handle install. All that we have left to do, it shouldn't take too long, is I have to open up the cowl, remove the little bottom piece of trim, and then install the shift cables and the wiring. So it shouldn't take too long, and then button it all up, and then the tiller arm will be installed. And then we're gonna do a little picking up, and then we'll be thinking about the next stage, which I think is gonna be ripping out the console. Bye-bye, console. Bye-bye. So removing the cowl is no great feat. You release the handle on the back and pop it off. Just about everyone can do that. But to get into the access cowl to actually play with all this stuff and remove the quote-unquote factory shifters and throttle control, you have to remove this bolt and this bolt right here. You can see right down there. And they are both 5/16, so 1/4 inch ratchet ought to do the trick. Or I should say 1/4 inch drive ratchet, to be clear. So you remove those 2 bolts. This whole cover just, kind of pops right off. Don't lose that. It's probably important. So the next step is to install the 14-pin connector for the tiller. But before we can install that, we have to remove the original one, the factory one. So we're going to unscrew it here. It routes here, loops around a couple times, runs out the front and over. So this plugs down there and hooks up to this thing, I think, to make everything work and run well. So I think this should just unthread. Should just unthread. Oh God. All right, I'm gonna need 2 hands. So it turns out it doesn't really unthread necessarily. It's just kind of a 1/4 turn. And it's a lot easier to do if you unclip it from the little retainer here, clip all the zip ties so that it's just kind of hanging loose and just kind of bends out. So now the next thing we gotta do is pull this out of this little grommet assembly, which it should just kind of pop right out like so. Oh God, oh God, okay, we're fine. Pops right out. So this is kind of a non-issue. And then we're gonna very carefully lay this nice new one from the tiller, feed it on through. So it does take a little bit of finagling to get all of the pins to line up correctly. And then this rotates a little differently than the interior, but anyway, it's pretty obvious where everything lines up. Then you clip it in there into the little retaining clip, and then you loop the little bit of excess. I zip tied it up here to this little bit of wiring harness so it's not just hanging out there free, and then it runs along here, and then it runs out to the tiller arm. And it looks like there's plenty of slack in there for this thing to fold up and down, and obviously left and right is irrelevant. But yeah, so the next step is we're going to remove the original shift linkage, which are these guys. We have to disconnect those very carefully, and then remove these cables, and then install these 2 gray cables that are the shift linkage for the tiller, for the for the throttle and the shifter. Uninstalling the factory cables is fairly straightforward. I've already went ahead and removed this nylock and washer. There's a little bow tie clip back here that I've already removed. So this guy comes out. I said this guy comes out. Thusly. And then this guy, there's a little clip here. You clip out of the way. And then you get this little bow tie clip. There's a little bow tie clip right in there. See if I can pull this out without sending it flying into the engine. I'm almost certainly gonna send this. Picked it out with a pair of pliers, and I should be able to lift this off, and then this should come right out. And then that pops off. This little guy comes off too, I guess. Where was that attached? And then this, oh God. And now we just dislodged the entire grommet. There we go. There's the 2 factory shifters. They gone. Don't need them no more. You'd like to know where the, oh, that little white cap wasn't there. Okay, that's where that goes. Okay, and now installation's the same as reverse. We're gonna start with the shifter cable. Oh God, grease. Got grease everywhere. Clean your workspace before you start, makes your life a lot easier. So we're gonna install the shifter cable first, and then the throttle cable, and then put all the clips back on, and we'll button it back up. And then we'll test everything, make sure it all works. Should be fairly simple. All right, so just quote unquote popping that cable right in was proving a lot more challenging. Something seemed amiss. I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get the shift cable that's supposed to pop in here and grab this thing, which is in the neutral position, why it wouldn't play nice. So I started retracing my steps, and I noticed when I played with this, it only shifted to about there, and I was like, well, that doesn't seem right. It feels like it should swing the whole way back and the whole way forward like it does now. Upon opening this back up, I had found out that I had half-assedly mounted these. This clip and that little flattened portion should be in this retaining groove here. I missed that. So this is how it should look with that flat portion all pinned down and clipped in. This is more or less how it was mounted. I can guarantee when I fix that and rerun that cable into there and get her all lined up, I bet everything's gonna line up perfectly. If you've installed one of these before, you probably caught that right off as I was installing it, but be smarter than me. Get that little flat portion of that clip lined up in the retaining groove like that, not like this. This is not correct. This would have caused me an enormous amount of mayhem had I not caught this. So again, this little flat part goes in that little groove. If you have it installed like so, you'll have full range of motion on the throttle and full range of motion on the shifter. And I bet now it'll line up just fine. And what do you know? Shift cable works just fine. So getting the cable all squared away is easy enough. Getting it adjusted takes a little bit of playing with. So basically there's a little collar, this little guy here, that you have to tighten and loosen up and down this threaded section here until basically it consistently shifts into forward and reverse. I think I got it, but honestly, when all is said and done, I'm gonna put some muffs on it, run the motor, and actually shift it back and forth, make sure it consistently engages. Because sometimes it seems like it needs like an 1/8 turn of the prop to get it to shift fully, but my boat kind of does that anyway. It might be a maintenance issue, but I don't think it is. I don't know. Leave me a comment if that's a thing that you get. But most of the time, it's just fine. Just the way I need it to. Every once in a while, it just seems like it wants to get hung up, but maybe that's just an idiosyncrasy with my boat. Maybe it's a maintenance concern. Let me know down in the comments if I should be worried about that. So next thing we gotta do is then basically do the same thing. Well, whatever. First, we gotta make sure, if you're doing this, make sure you get your little banjo clip in there. Make sure you get your little retention tab. This guy, put back in there thusly, so it's retained. And then that cable can't go anywhere. You got a little bow tie clip in there, a little plastic retainer clip there. Now I'll put in the throttle cable, I suppose. Installing the throttle cable is a lot easier, primarily because there's not really any adjustment associated with it. You just adjust this. This isn't clearly laid out in the manual, but intuitively it makes sense, right? Like this throttle, when there's no throttle applied, it wants to spring back to this position. So you tighten and loosen this retaining plastic until it lines up and you can install it as is and bolt this down. And then that's obviously with the throttle completely loose, and then, the throttle at 0 on the tiller handle, and then obviously we tighten it to full throttle. Fairly straightforward mechanic. Not really any adjustment. Not like the shifter where you really kind of got to get it right. Or it doesn't work. So installing this little panel again was a bit of a pain in the butt. Just because of how these cables lay in this grommet, it's a little, I don't know, man. Everything seems to work the way it's supposed to, but this angle is a little tough for those dense cables to traverse. So this grommet's not exactly perfect. Getting it lined up was kind of sketchy at best, but everything seems to be more or less lined up the way it's supposed to, so I guess we can just do the best we can. So all we gotta do is cap this guy off, and that will conclude this tiller install. The only other thing I may do, actually before I wrap up, is I may disconnect this bolt, and then that'll remove the cable steering assembly, and this will truly be a tiller. So we're gonna see how tough that is. So again, taking off this bolt, loosening this bolt and the original steering hardware, and then the next time you check in with this video, we should be done. All right, well, upon further inspection, removing the rest of the steering hardware is gonna require removing this assembly, which is gonna be drilling out some rivets and pulling this out, and frankly, I'm over it. So I'm gonna call part 1, installation of the tiller handle, complete. It is installed. It is the primary steering apparatus of this boat, even though that cable's still in the way. I'm gonna call this thing done. I still am not sure what the one stray bolt is. I looked at a bunch of part diagrams and I could not figure out where this little guy goes in my boat. Where the manual says there should be another thing to remove to reinstall this, I can't find anything. So I think what I'm gonna end up doing is omitting it. And if I find out where it goes, I will put a comment in the description, or maybe I'll just do a follow-up video and link it here. Just because I don't think this part was included for my boat. I think, or I should say for my motor. It's 40 through 60 horse, so maybe the 60 horse or the 40 horse has another little secondary friction bolt, but trying to find a secondary friction bolt for the 50 horse, I couldn't find anything, so I'm not gonna worry about it. You should never have extra parts. It makes me nervous, but we're just gonna make do with what we got. So with that, part 1 is complete. As far as I can tell, it's successful. We'll do a big grand reveal video later where we test everything, make sure everything's squared away. But thanks for watching this long, and look forward to part 2, where we remove the console, which will be fun. So it's gonna be kind of a demo day before some construction. So part 2, remove the console, coming soon. Thanks, guys.